What if I told you that the answers you've been desperately seeking from God were always there, softly whispering, but your own thoughts, fears, and anxieties have been blocking you from hearing His voice? Have you ever stopped to think about how many times the Lord tried to speak to you, but because of that inner noise, you couldn't hear Him? In the dry, dusty valleys of Canaan, where the nights were cold and the days were hard, lived Macedo, a man who seemed to carry an invisible burden. His face was always marked by a deep look of meditation, as if his soul was trapped in an endless internal dialogue. His days were spent between heavy work and silent prayers, like someone planting seeds in dry soil, eagerly waiting for fruits that never seemed to come. Macedo was known for his kind character and unwavering faith, but few knew the storms that haunted him from within. He had grown up in a family with strong spiritual values and, since childhood, had been taught to trust God in every moment. Yet, as the years passed, his life became filled with uncertainties, questions that seemed to have no answers, and a deep sense of emptiness. Each night, Macedo would kneel before the altar he had built in his home and whisper words of supplication, hoping to hear something, anything, that would confirm that God was still with him. Others saw him as a devout man, but only he knew the silence that surrounded him. He feared that his faith was failing, and that God, in His infinite wisdom, had abandoned him. The nights were long, and in the solitude of his room, Macedo would cry silently, wondering why his mind was so full of doubts, thoughts, and fears. Was it that God didn't want to speak to him? Or was he the one who didn't know how to listen? Macedo began to notice that the noise in his mind grew louder. His thoughts swirled in an endless storm, mixing memories, desires, and fears. The voices of worry and unease became so constant that he could hardly focus on his prayers. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would wake up sweating, with his heart racing, convinced that God was speaking to him, only to realize it was his own fear waking him up. It was then that, one morning, Macedo decided he needed to do something about it. He had heard of men of God who would withdraw to the desert, away from the distractions of the world, to hear His voice in the silence. With determination, Macedo grabbed his cloak, some bread and water, and headed for the solitary hills, in search of the peace and silence he so desperately needed. He sat on a rock and closed his eyes, ready to listen, but to his surprise, the noise in his mind did not cease. There, in the quiet of the desert, his thoughts seemed even louder, and Macedo felt his heart fill with frustration. Why? Even in this desolate place, couldn't he find peace? His longings to hear God were so strong, but his soul remained deaf. He didn't understand that the real noise didn't come from outside, but from his own heart, filled with unresolved anxieties and desires. In that isolated place, Macedo spent hours fighting with his thoughts, his impatience, and his desire for a clear answer from God. He realized that the noise wasn't an external obstacle, but something deeper, a barrier he had built himself. Yet Macedo wasn't ready to give up. His desire to hear God was stronger than his frustration, and with every breath, he armed himself with patience, knowing that perhaps this inner struggle was part of the journey. The sun began to set, and the chill of the desert started to settle in. Macedo, exhausted from the silent battle, looked up at the sky and let out a sigh that seemed to carry away his last bit of hope. As the cold wind hit his face, a thought began to form in his mind. What if, in the end, God had decided not to speak to him? What if his prayers weren't worthy enough for God to listen? Suddenly, in the midst of his anguish, something he never expected happened. A strong wind began to blow between the rocks, raising dust and sand all around him. Macedo felt a chill, and a whispering voice seemed to fill the silence. "Why do you doubt my presence, when I have always been by your side?" The words echoed in his mind, and his heart raced, as if recognizing that this voice came from a sacred, deep place. It was a soft voice, but so clear that it seemed to calm the noise in his mind. However, just as Macedo was preparing to respond in his mind, the wind stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence returned to the desert, and the noise in his mind came back, drowning out that brief moment of peace he had felt. Confused and desperate, He stood up and shouted, "Lord, I don't understand. If you're here, why don't you speak in a way I can understand?" His shout was lost among the mountains, and the echo of his own voice was all that responded. Frustrated and broken, Macedo fell to his knees, letting his tears flow freely. He had believed that by retreating to the desert, he would find the peace he so desperately sought. But now he felt further from God than ever. In that moment, a dark thought took hold of him. Maybe he would never receive an answer, and his whole life would be a journey in silence. Days passed, and Macedo did not leave that place. The nights were cold, and his body, weakened from fasting and praying, began to deteriorate. Despite his devotion, a terrible sense of abandonment tormented him. He began to wonder if it was a punishment, if there was something about him that prevented him from being worthy of hearing God's voice. His mind was trapped in a cycle of questions and fears, only intensifying his anguish. Then, one night, while sleeping, he had a dream so vivid that it woke him suddenly. In the dream, he walked down a dark path, surrounded by shadows, and a small light shone in the distance. Every time he tried to get closer to the light, his own steps seemed to lead him astray, and the more he tried, the further he went. Finally, he fell to the ground, exhausted, and at that moment, he heard a voice say, "The peace you seek is not on the path you are taking, but in the stillness of your heart." When he awoke, Macedo understood something important. The noise in his mind was not an obstacle to be overcome with force, but a barrier that required inner transformation. God didn't want him to seek a sign in the outer world, but to learn to find his voice in the silence of his own being. This moment was devastating for Macedo because he realized that he had misunderstood God's will for years. Yet, at that same instant, something inside him shifted. Despite the confusion and pain he felt, for the first time in a long time, he began to experience a deep peace, as if he had finally let go of a burden he had been carrying for years. At dawn, Macedo remained still, processing the words from that dream, as if it were a message he needed to decode through his own silence. For days, he ceased pleading and asking. Instead, he focused on quieting his mind, paying attention to each breath, and observing the thoughts that passed through his mind, without getting carried away by them. Little by little, he began to notice something. The more he stopped fighting the noise, the less intense the internal storm became. But it wasn't an easy process. Every time he reached moments of peace, thoughts of hopelessness and painful memories would return, assaulting him with greater force. He remembered the difficult moments of his life, the losses he had suffered, the mistakes he carried, and the unsaid words that haunted him. Often, his own fears would drag him back into that abyss of doubt. But this time, Macedo decided not to run away or defend himself. He would remain in that quietude, trusting that, somehow, God was working in him. Day by day, he surrendered to this silent effort, like a warrior fighting without a sword. It was a battle against his own anxieties, a challenge to his faith, a struggle that seemed endless. In moments of quiet, he could feel his thoughts trying to drag him back into anxiety. But he continued. With each breath, Macedo believed a little more that, deep down, he wasn't alone. God was right there, closer than he had ever imagined. And then, one day, while meditating at dawn, he felt a gentle touch in his heart. It was as if something had been softly awakened inside him. It wasn't an audible voice, nor a dazzling vision, but the sensation that something had changed. He felt a peace so profound that words became unnecessary. Finally, Macedo understood. The answer he had been seeking was not in grand signs or miracles, but in the stillness of his soul, where God had always been, waiting for him to be ready to hear.